Hello families, and welcome to Whitfield Elementary. My name is Mr. Curry, and I'm extremely excited to join you on your child's educational journey for the 23-24 school year. Well, families and community, here we go. We are just taking off to reach for the stars, which is our theme for the 23-24 school year. At Whitfield, we are excited to work together in a partnership with you and your children to support them on their learning journey. Some things that we want to make sure that we support our students with is helping them with their attendance and making sure that they're here on time every day, especially at the earliest levels where we build their early literacy and early numeracy skills. Another focus that we're going to have here as we reach for the stars at Whitfield is our social and emotional learning. This year, we have embedded a morning meeting into each day within our kindergarten through 5th grade classrooms. Our hope is that we are able to utilize this time to develop a classroom community where children feel comfortable with each other to support their learning socially and emotionally in the classroom. We understand that all children are on different learning paths, so this year we are going to be focusing on our MTSS, our multi-tiered systems of support, to support the academic needs of our children throughout their school day. Your child may find themselves in large group instruction as well as small group instruction, and occasional support from one of our interventionists or reading specialists to ensure that learning is at their level. Another part that is important to us is our community partnership. It takes a village to raise a child, and we want you to be a part of our village. Please make sure to check out our district website and get all clearances on file prior to any events that may occur. Field trips and Watchdog Dads, as well as many other experiences, will come up throughout the school year. Have your clearances so we can have you work along with our staff to support our students. At Whitfield, we want to make sure all children feel safe, and we want to set our students up for success. So we aim to support our students with building skills so that they are respectful, responsible, and safe. Developing these skills through our PBIS system will help our students create a learning environment where students love to learn, where our staff loves to work, and where our community wants to live. Thank you, families, for sharing your children with us on their learning journey. We are so excited to work alongside you during this experience, and we look forward to seeing you throughout the year. Have a great night meeting your child's teachers.
Let's meet the staff of Whitfield Elementary. Mr. Croft is our Dean of Students. Mr. Paul is our school custodian. Our office staff is Ms. Widener, Mrs. Hummel, and Mrs. Folk. In the nurses suite, we've got Nurse Allison and Nurse Robin. In kindergarten, we have Miss Palmer, Miss Lucarelli, Miss Sellis, Miss Hassler, and Miss Whitmoyer. Our first grade team is Mrs. Ice Collins, Mrs. Tonsel, Mrs. Osterberry, Mrs. Weaver, and Mrs. Huff. In second grade, we have Miss Black, Miss Schlechter, Mrs. Southwick, Mrs. Winter, and Miss Hodnick. Our third grade team is Mrs. Matten, Mrs. Hewitt, Mrs. Konopelski, Mr. Schlegel, and Mrs. Schaefer. In fourth grade, we have Mrs. Hanwork, Mrs. Periandy, Mr. Dietrich, and Mrs. Brindle. Our 5th grade team is Mrs. Curran, Mr. Hewitt, Mr. Shulk, and Mrs. McCrae. Let's meet our special education team at Whitfield. Mrs. Bell is our intermediate autistic support, Mrs. Haymaker, primary autistic support, and Mrs. Recapito, intermediate life skills. Mrs. Wayman is our primary life skills teacher, Mrs. Good is the teacher of the visually impaired, and Mrs. Potasiewicz teaches our multiple disabilities classroom. Mrs. Creamer is speech and language, and Dr. Luff is our occupational therapist. Mrs. Cup is our learning support, along with Mrs. Sochko and Mr. Kewen. Here we have Ms. Herner, our ESL teacher. Here is our special support staff with Ms. Reganis, Mrs. Kramer, Mrs. Adams, Mrs. Ziemba, and Mr. Buckley. In gifted support, we have Mrs. Fick and Mrs. Gleason. Our music teacher is Mrs. Lynch. Down in the gymnasium, you'll find Mrs. Worrell teaching physical education. Our art teacher is Mrs. Flanagan. Teaching discovery is Mr. Durham from a galaxy far, far away. In the library, we have Mrs. Schultz, our librarian. Mrs. Barbin is our school counselor for grades 3rd, 4th, and 5th. Ms. Bowman is our school counselor for kindergarten, 1st grade, and 2nd grade. Teaching orchestra, we have Mrs. Lakatsas.